Well, thank you again for watching. I didn't really want to make a video so soon, a non-beer related video, but because I don't want to flood my subscribers with a bunch of videos and they'd be irritated. I can understand that. Although people I'm subscribed to, some of them will make just like Stuart Pickard, Jen Rail Trail. He might make 20 videos in a day. I'll just scroll through them and watch the ones that are relevant to what I'm trying to learn about. But it does bother some people if you make too many. But some people, I had mentioned I would do this earlier, and some people had asked for me to do the video. And then this is the 150th anniversary of the end of, sort of like the end of the subject matter of the video. So I figured it was apropos. And the title is Secession in 1860 to 61 was a mistake. Okay, let me try to explain what I'm talking about. Most people with some kind of, there goes the Kansas City Southern, and hopefully the phone won't ring, but invariably if I go to make a video, then the phone won't ring for 8 hours straight, and then, he's making a video, hurry, start calling. But let me try to explain what I mean by this. This is an opinion. It's not a fact, right? So the fact is in 1860, December 1860, South Carolina rescinded the ratification of the Union of 1788. And then other states followed, and then some more states followed. But we got to go back. I know people say, not again, go back. You have to go back in history a little bit, all right, to establish what you're talking about. And I'm drinking some water, my friends, some lovely tap water. Most excellent indeed. No beer, because I got a beer review I'm going to do at 3 o'clock. All right. Anyway, we know that the 13 colonies seceded from Great Britain in the Kingdom of Great Britain in 1776. We call them the 13 colonies because they were the 13 colonies that seceded. There were other colonies that did not secede, like Nova Scotia, which New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island also came from other colonies that broke, the British broke from those because, that happens. You get a big, just in America, you get a big territory, and as people move out into the territory, you break it up. We got Quebec, the former French colony the British controlled, didn't secede. And in fact, when the Americans sent troops in to liberate Quebec, more like invade it and take it over, but they had no interest in breaking away, really. There was a vote in 1995 to secede from the Commonwealth realm of Canada. It didn't pass. Okay, Jamaica didn't vote to secede. The Bahama Islands did not vote to secede. Okay, so, but anyway, these 13 colonies did vote to secede, and the British said, we can't do that, so they had a war, and the colonies won with a bunch of help from France and the Netherlands and Spain, of course. But anyway, the British said, forget it. In 1783, they recognized that the colonies were the independent United States of America, a loose confederation of states, the United States of America. Then we know in 1787, some people, not everybody, but some people felt that the Union wasn't, tight enough. So they had a constitutional convention, and they decided we're going to adopt a new constitution, get rid of the Articles of Confederation, and adopt the Constitution, which would make a federated union instead of a confederated union, and we'll let the states decide. And 13 out of 13 eventually voted to do it. 1788, and then it went into it, and then they had the first election for president in 1788. George Washington elected, etc. Okay, we know that. They barely, maybe that's not a good word, but they had some trouble getting the Union together because the southern states and the northern states generally had a very different view of how the country should be run. They had different outlook on how states should develop, and it was seen at the time really that they may not be compatible, but they made all kind of different compromises. They didn't make solutions, they made compromises, just because they wanted the union more than to try to solve all these problems. But the compromises sort of like put the problems on the back burner. They didn't, like I said, did not solve the problems. So as the decades went on, these problems that had been put on the back burner continued to develop in a very bad way. So by 1850, it looked like this union might have been a big mistake. I mean, these states cannot get along. The southern states have their own idea of what they should do, what should happen in the U.S., and the northern states have their own idea. And they kept making these compromises, like in 1821 or 1820, but it kind of went into effect in 21. The Great Compromise of 1850, just trying to keep the thing together because it was really not working out. Most Americans, North or South, probably just wanted the country to stay together and maybe didn't grasp all the political problems. But then you always have these extremists on either end of the argument. And in the South, you've had this hardcore 5, at the most 10%, but probably not that high. Extremists, Southern nationalist extremists. And in the North, you had this 5 to 10, probably not that high, percent of these agitator extremists, that just have to have everything their way. And so oftentimes in a conflict, the people with the most extreme views they get the most coverage, they get the most attention. It's like today, if you see some problem like in Ferguson, Missouri, or other racial things, the media will blow it up and make a big thing, and then the people that they'll show on TV that they'll interview will be the most extremists. You'll have these racial nationalists down there stirring up problems, the ambulance chasers, the ones like the Sharptons. If it's white on white, they don't care. If it's black on black, they're indifferent to it, doesn't matter. But if it's white on black, especially a white authority on black, that fits the revolutionary outlook that they have. So they run down there like that, like I say, the civil rights ambulance chasers, to stir up trouble. And then it's almost like they're hoping for a racial conflict. I don't know. That could be a good video, but it's like they're crazy, But you had the same problem in the 1850s. You have these extremists. It's almost like they wanted a conflict, like they were looking for trouble. In the North, you had the abolitionists, who tended to be very extreme. Your John Brown types, they're mostly Calvinists from New England, the stereotypical New England Yankee extremists, Unitarian, Universalist, Freemasonic, elitist, capitalist troublemaker, right? All they want to do is rule the world. I mean, why you can't let this happen? And of course, they're always pro-British and they're in cahoots with all that. But anyway, so like they're allowed, and that's not even most New Englanders, right? But it's this abolitionist, Harriet Beecher Stowe, William Lloyd Garrison extremist group. What do we want? Abolition of slavery. When do we want it? Now. As though that were any kind of way possible, right? You have a country that was based on the idea that they would allow states to have slavery. That was the whole compromise, part of the compromise of 1787. Because without that compromise, there would be no United States of America. Well, they might have kept the Articles of Loose Confederation, but it would have been no constitution adopted by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, but you have the abolitionists live in this fantasy world where everything has to be perfect right now. And, well, what if it destroys the United States? We don't care. And this is the attitude of William Lloyd Garrison, Slavery's so bad that if we have to destroy the whole United States and start a war that kills millions of people or 1 million people, we don't care. We just don't care because we want these people to go free immediately. Totally impractical view. which most people in the North didn't want to hear. You know, people in the South weren't going to listen to it, but in the North, they just thought these people are crazy, you know. So, and they stated it. William Lloyd Garrison said the Constitution was trash. He wanted to tear it up because it was based on the idea that they would allow slavery. And you had your John Brown types who were willing to start a revolution. Some people said he was a terrorist. He wasn't really a terrorist, because terrorists try to use terrorism, right? Fear, spread fear to get people to lose their morale in a struggle. He wasn't really trying to do that. He was just trying to spark a black uprising in the South, where all the slaves would rise up and win their freedom. Another totally impractical idea, but you know, he was loony. He was out there in Kansas killing people in the 1850s, and then in 1859 he wants to launch this revolution, and then really no slaves helped him. They're just looking around like, what is this going on? Okay, so you got that attitude in the North. Now, Lincoln, he was not an abolitionist. He wasn't pro-slavery. Okay, now you got to understand the difference. He didn't like slavery. He thought it was morally wrong. He would like to see it go away, but he was practical in the sense that he knew it wasn't going to go away tomorrow. It would take a long effort. But he was more concerned about keeping the United States as a solid union, naturally, with the leadership of being led by northern states, the northern capitalist, industrialist power, right? That's what he wanted. He wanted all the West to develop and it'd be a big, white, powerful, industrialized country, capitalist country. That's what Lincoln wanted. And you say, why? Now you might be listening and say, why do you say white? Well, maybe people don't understand Lincoln too well. Now, I said earlier that your average American would know about the U.S. getting formed and some states seceded, and they had a fight between states. Those are the average American hopefully would know. Maybe young people may not even know that. Education has gotten so bad. But now we're getting a little more deep into it. So Lincoln, he even said his main goal was to keep the Union united, because he wasn't, okay, so he was not a radical. Keep the Union united at all costs. He said if it takes getting rid of all the if it takes getting rid of all slavery, you know, freeing all the slaves to keep the Union united, fine. If it takes freeing some of the slaves and letting the other ones stay in slavery to keep the Union united, that's fine too. Or if it requires no slaves going free to keep the Union together, that's fine, because that was his main goal. So freeing the slaves was sort of like very far down the ladder for Lincoln. He certainly didn't want it spreading out west, and most Northerners did not want slavery spreading out west. Why is that? Because they had a great moral objection to it. Mostly it was because they wanted the West to be an all-white area. They were going to drive out the Indians, and it was going to be an all-white area, or drive them onto reservations. They made these statements. If you read the writings of the Free Soilers, who went into Kansas and other areas, you know, they said, we don't want these Southerners bringing in these, we are not going to Africanize the West. That was what terms they used. It's going to be a white man's paradise. It's not going to be an Africanized area. They said, we got Africa in the South, and we don't want to spread it. We want containment, sort of like the containment policy. All right. Now the South, we'll get back to Lincoln and all that in a little while. The South, okay. Most Southerners probably wanted the country to stay united. Okay. Most Southerners did not own slaves, although probably most Southerners were indifferent to slavery and didn't have a great moral objection to it, I'm sure. Certainly didn't want racial integration by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, but you had some radicals who will go around writing articles about slavery as an objectively good thing. It's a holy thing. The Bible condones it. Jesus told slaves to be loyal to their masters, not only with eye service or lip service, but with their heart. And that's true. Jesus did say that slaves should not just pretend to love their masters, but truly love their masters. Contrariwise, he said masters should love slaves like their, really, what are you saying, like their own children. So, but you had these fanatics say, oh yes, it's a holy thing. Slavery is a holy thing. Now, most Southerners maybe didn't believe that, and they certainly didn't believe slave trading. They thought that was a dirty business, right? Like prostitution or something. I mean, in the South and in the North, people might tolerate prostitution, but they sure didn't want it in their neighborhood, and they didn't want a slave trading market in their neighborhood. All right. But you had these radicals say, we want slavery to spread out west. We don't like these Northerners who are so prejudiced against the Negro. These Northerners are so prejudiced. They want it to be all white. We want to bring our slaves out there. Wasn't really because they were worried about prejudice. They just want to bring their slaves out there. All right, so they could perpetuate slavery. It was a big money-making business with all of the cotton production and sugarcane and rice production. Okay. There's another part to it. It's a struggle between states and power. The South and the North generally had an even number of states. You know, and when it got to be 30, it was 15 and 15 and whatever. It was even. So the South felt like we get treated equally. They can't boss us around. But as time developed, it became apparent that as the West developed, as time went on, it became apparent that as the West developed and new states were created out of the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican Cession and the Oregon Territory, that the majority of those states would not allow slavery because most of the people moving out, they were from the North and they wanted it to be a white-only area. The South, they could see this. It's not going to work. We're going to be outnumbered soon enough. There's going to be a lot more free states or non-slave-holding states than slave-holding states. So another reason to promote slavery out there was not to necessarily spread slavery, but also to keep the number of Southern-oriented states at the same level of the North. By 1850, they realized it wasn't going to happen, so they started to become paranoid. The South started to become paranoid, and when people become paranoid, they make bad decisions. Like Germany was very paranoid in 1914. Okay, so by 1850, the South became increasingly paranoid. As that decade went on, they became more and more paranoid, the Southern states. So as their paranoia increases, the voice of the extremists gets louder and people listen to them more, okay? Whereas before 1850, they'd say, oh, shut up, you know, you bunch of radicals. And some things occurred that made them paranoid, right? Like this low-level civil war in Kansas, which the media helped exacerbate and get everybody even more paranoid and uptight. And you had all these crazy things happening, like some revelation in the newspaper that the president was conspiring to have Cuba annexed as a southern state. You know, some totally crackpot idea, but people say, oh, look, the South is in a conspiracy. And then John Brown does his thing, his Revolutionary Act in 1859. And then when he's buried, you have towns all over the North ringing bells in his honor. That really set off a wave of extreme paranoia in the South. This really was the key, because when John Brown did his raid in Virginia in 1859, that did more to split the country up than almost anything. Harriet Beecher Stowe publishing the novel, right, Uncle Tom's Cabin. That was another thing that really spread paranoia, because in the South, the book was banned by many states. People say that violates the First Amendment. It did not violate the First Amendment, because that only applied to the U.S. government. Okay, until the 14th Amendment was passed. But and the people in the South said, what a horrible book. They're trying to denigrate our culture. And then in the North, there was such a big selling book, and people read the book and said, oh, slavery's terrible, whereas maybe before they didn't care about it. And so then as the people in the North became more and more anti-slavery, the people in the South, maybe they were indifferent before, now they become hardened. You know, who are you to tell us how to live? You know, that kind of attitude. So then it gets really scary, right? So by 1859, once John Brown did his raid, that's it. It's really, everything's on edge. Now there's this fear all over the South that there are elements in the North trying to spark a black uprising, the greatest fear of the South. And that is the one idea in the South that was likely to make people totally flip out and to become unhinged and to act in a way that was abnormally violent. There was this overriding fear in the South that there would be a black uprising that would happen one night and they would go around raping and killing white women. So you have the South, which was armed to the teeth, like every civilian had major caches of weapons, rifles, ammo. Sort of like today. All right. So anyway, that didn't really change, did it? All right. So so you have that feeling in the South. They're going to try to murder us. And the feeling was that the black people were this is the feeling of the South now, the black people were generally happy, but that they were being agitated upon by Northern conspiratorial activity. And then John Brown's raid confirmed this in their minds, that there's this bad, terrible thing that's going to happen. And if it does set off, and the attitude in the South was, if this sparks off, we're just going to all go berserk. Generally, that was the attitude. They would just go berserk, and that that any perceived enemy, any enemies or perceived enemies would be wiped out. This is the attitude. Okay, that there would be a cultural Gotterdammerung. All right. And when those bells rang, and then when the reports came in that they were ringing bells in the North for John Brown's, at the moment John Brown was hung by the U.S. government, then the Southerners say, that's it. I mean, that's it. If the Republican Party comes into power, we're out of here. So Lincoln's trying to say, no, I'm not like those people. I'm not going to try to end slavery. None of that stuff. But he wanted a high tariff, which was another thing that caused problems, because in the South, they were so against high tariffs. They wanted low tariffs. The Democrats, Southern Democrats, the Democratic Party was always for low tariffs. The Northern capitalist Republicans were always for high tariffs to protect American big business. Okay. That's another problem. It's not just slavery. It's the whole capitalism versus agrarian life. Okay. They have the campaign, right? The Democratic Party in 1860 split. The Northern Democrats don't want slavery spreading out west. The Southern Democrats do sort of want it, but they just cannot agree on these things. And so the Democratic Party split. The Northern Democrats elected their own candidate. The Southern Democrats elected their own candidate. It's a real problem. Stephen Douglas going to run for the North, and Breckinridge for the South. And then there was a party in the middle states, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia. Those states were pro-North and pro-South because they're in the middle, right? They're slave states, but they did a lot of trade. They were right on the border, so they did a lot of trade with the northern states. They definitely did not want to break away at all. And they entertain extremists much less. So they had their own candidate, the Constitutional Union Party. So let's have a compromise candidate. And then the Republicans in the North, the old former Whig Party, right? The former Whig Party. Before that, it was the National Republicans of Alexander Hamilton. Big national empire, industrialized capitalist empire that would be in league with Great Britain to control world affairs, which is what we have today. But that's what Alexander Hamilton wanted, with the U.S. National Bank to control the money supply, et cetera, et cetera. Lincoln is like the icon of that party. Well, since the Democratic Party was split, their electoral vote was sabotaged in the whole country. So their electoral vote is split. And their popular vote is split, which led to the electoral split. And then Lincoln, he wins the popular vote in all the northern states. And he wins all the northern electoral votes, no southern electoral votes whatsoever. So he only wins 40-something% of the national vote, which is not a real vote. We know that. And he wins a majority of the electoral votes, and that's what counts. A lot of people don't understand how Electoral College works. Just like Al Gore won the popular vote in 2000, but he lost the electoral vote. And he tried to say, oh, even though the will of the people was such and such, the system says I lose. That's right. The system does say you lose. Because that's how the system works. All right. Lincoln, most Americans voted against Lincoln, okay? Most Americans voted against Lincoln. The majority of Americans, a good, strong majority, voted against Lincoln. But he won the northern states, so he was elected president by the Electoral College. And this set off a total panic in the South because they're perceiving incorrectly that Lincoln is the abolitionist candidate, and when he takes over, he's going to outlaw slavery. But he had no intention of doing that. And not only that, he also proposed, remember, he proposed that once the war did start, he proposed after the war that all the black people could be deported to Africa. This was Lincoln's idea. It was impractical also, but his idea was maybe to make sure we have an all-white country, since whites and blacks are incompatible, and he stated repeatedly he believed in white supremacy in America. The white man should rule America. That blacks should be deported back to Africa where they would be happier with their own race. This is not the Lincoln that is going to be on NBC or CBS News as they talk about his 150th anniversary of his murder, but that is the true Lincoln. So that's what he wanted to do. But in the South, they thought he's going to try to outlaw slavery. He wasn't going to try to do that. But that was their perception. Oh, Lincoln's been elected, he's going to outlaw slavery. How he could do that, I don't know. You see, some calmer voices in the South said, no, how could he do that? It would take a constitutional amendment, and that would mean 75% of the states would have to vote for this, which would never occur. So, you know, he can't outlaw slavery even if he wants to. It wouldn't even matter if they had a majority of the Congress. You would have to have a super majority, and you would have to have a super duper majority of the states. No way that would happen. All right. But South Carolina, really, they panicked. So in December 1860, the legislature of South Carolina said, we are voting to secede, meaning this: we are withdrawing our approval of our 1788 vote to join the Union. In fact, when many of the states joined the Union under the Constitution in 1787-88, they put into their ratification that they reserved the right to repeal the ratification at any time. Yes, and in fact, if these states had known that they would not be allowed to secede later on if they felt like they didn't want to be part of the country, the ratification would have never occurred. There would not have been a constitution in 1788, would not have happened. If they had been under the assumption that they could never leave the Union, it would have never happened. Okay, so South Carolina said, well, we're going to rescind our ratification of 1788, and we will return to what we were before independent country, South Carolina. So they said, now we are once again the Republic of South Carolina, with no longer in association with the United States of America. They always had considered that they were the Republic of South Carolina before that. And then in January, other southern states began to drop out too: Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, and Georgia, and Florida. Okay. And then they had a meeting and they decided that they would become the Confederate States of America, kind of sort of like adopting the Articles of Confederation, and they put that slavery would be perpetual and that the capital would be in Montgomery, Alabama. Lincoln got inaugurated in March, and he said, well, we want to keep the states united. The secession is illegal. That was his opinion, based on, I don't know what he was basing it on, because it was obviously not illegal. They had already said when they ratified it in '88 that they could withdraw at any time. And if secession was illegal, then that means the United States was illegal because they had seceded from Great Britain. So his whole logic there was faulty, but that was just him saying that. It's illegal in my opinion. Good. Your opinion is invalid. But anyway, your opinion is invalid based upon obvious facts of history. But the more important thing is that he said, he would like to see a constitutional amendment which would declare that slavery would be perpetually protected in the states that had it. Now, you don't see this on CBS News or ABC News, right? Or the New York Times newspaper, that Lincoln proposed a constitutional amendment to protect slavery in perpetuity, because they're going to frame Lincoln as something he was not. Okay. But the Southern Confederate States, you know, here's the flag they adopted, similar to the United States of America. The stars and bars, not stripes, and the original stars of the states. More stars are added as more states seceded. Now, why do I say it was a mistake? What they did was a mistake. Here's why I say it was a mistake. He was not a radical, and he was not going to try to outlaw slavery. And if they had listened to moderate voices like the New Orleans Picayune, which is a paper still in business, barely. They could go out of business before I finished talking, by the way. But they were a moderate paper. They were more like a old Southern Whig Party paper that wanted a national Henry Clay, you know, unified country with railroads and highways and bridges and be a world empire and all that. So they said, no, you're jumping the gun. But even they were saying that until Lincoln got elected. Now, when it was announced that Lincoln had been elected, the New Orleans Picayune, the old Whig, Southern Whig paper, said, well, we are no longer moderate. We have to secede. We have no choice. We must secede now. So that's the great fear. Even the moderates now are starting to become the radicals. They starting to believe what they had been told, that the great tragedy is upon us. And it's easy for me to look back and say, y'all shouldn't have done that. I know, in hindsight, I might have been out there right on the steps saying, we got to get out now, right? But now I'm looking back saying it was a mistake, because the rules of the U.S. Senate are such that a good minority, a strong minority, and the South was a strong minority in numbers in the Senate, could block any kind of changes, okay? There wouldn't be any kind of radical statutes passed. Secondly, there certainly wouldn't be any constitutional amendments passed. Okay, what did we have during the war? The 13th Amendment, later the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and all the other amendments that the South didn't want. Well, none of that would have passed if they had not seceded. Never. It would never have passed. So they could have gummed up all of that. Okay. All right. So then Lincoln might have tried to pass all these things like a high tariff and whatnot, but it probably wouldn't have passed. So there was a rush into this chasm. It was unnecessary. They could have strung this out. Now, of course, slavery, you know, the world changed. Even Saudi Arabia outlawed slavery in 1962, right? 53 years ago. So that was going to change. That was going to end. If the U.S. hadn't seceded from Great Britain, it probably would have ended in 1833 without any trouble. Because the British outlawed slavery in 1833 with almost no problems. We got to do it our way in America. So all the things the South feared, secession actually brought upon rapidly, whereas staying in the Union could have kept it from happening for decades. Decades. And then the more moderate voices in the South, because you always had Southern liberals all along, even during the Civil Rights days, they might have won out, and you could have had a slow progression of change, and slavery could have been phased out, and there could have been no violence. Everybody would have been, well, not everybody, but most people would have been more or less happy, have a nice, peaceful United States without all this terrible war that broke out in 1861, when you had 600,000 troops killed and about 400,000 civilians, and the whole southern states wrecked. All right. So what a terrible mistake they made, because they panicked. Panic. Paranoia. So, but they did it. Now, you're asking me, did I think they were wrong for doing it? Now, notice I never said the South was wrong to secede. You didn't see that anywhere on the title. I'm not saying that the Southern states were wrong or immoral. South Carolina certainly had a right to secede. That was their right. They joined the country freely, and they said very clearly when they joined in 1788 that they would leave if they felt uncomfortable being in the country. So certainly they had a right to break away. Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, Texas, South Carolina, and Georgia and Florida all certainly had the right to become independent countries and become free, you know, the republics, the Republic of Texas. Certainly Texas, more than any state, had a right to secede, because if you look at the treaty that Texas signed with the United States to become a state, it very clearly said that Texas could withdraw from the U.S. at any time. That's still valid on the books today. I mean, there's no way the Supreme Court could override that. That was mutually agreed upon. And in fact, the treaty said that Texas could choose to create itself into up to 5 new states if they chose. So Texas could vote this year to become 5 new states. And instead of having 2 votes in the Senate, Texas could actually have 10 votes in the Senate. I mean, they're not going to do that, but they could technically vote to do that. But Lincoln, he's got this idea that the North is going to rule the country. The Northern capitalist power base is going to rule the country. And you're not going to break away because, in my opinion, it's illegal. And the Southern states said, oh, that's your opinion. We've broken away. We've already broken away. They already created their own militias, state army. The Confederate states created their own monetary system, their own provisional constitution. They elected their own provisional president, later a permanent president, when was formally adopted in 1862. They had their own flag, their own military, state militias, and national Confederation military. So they said, it's too bad. I mean, we've already broken away. And some of the more farsighted Southerners could see it coming even during the 1850s, during the Fillmore administration and Buchanan administration. Some Southerners in power were slowly moving assets to the South, like military assets, made sure that the Southern U.S. military bases were well stocked with materiel because they thought it could happen. Can't necessarily disagree with that. If you see it coming, you may as well get ready. All right, so yeah, of course they had a right to break away. Now Lincoln was determined that they can't now break away. Now some people will say, oh, well, the South fired the first shot at Fort Sumter. They started the war. Let's look at this in intelligent. Let's try to look at this in an intelligent manner instead of a loud, partisan manner. You say the South fired the first shot at Fort Sumter. In a technical sense, you might be right. In a real sense, you're totally wrong. Now let's look at why you're totally wrong. When these states broke away as independent countries, obviously they had a right. Is it not true that an independent country has a right to control all the assets within its own borders? Is it not true that, like say a U.S. fortress, a U.S. military base, a U.S. Any kind of United States military assets would certainly become the property of the state which seceded? Wouldn't that not be the case? When the Philippines became an independent country, now they controlled their country, right? And then in 1992, they decided that those military bases should belong to them, and they took them over, and the U.S. couldn't do anything about it because it was the Philippines, it was their country. Now, so South Carolina, all these U.S. military assets were immediately seized across the South because they realized that they had to control you can't claim you're an independent country if you don't control your internal assets. When the United States seceded from Great Britain, is it not true that they immediately seized British assets across the South? This is a little button I bought at the Confederate Museum in New Orleans on Camp Street. Anyway, though there was one military facility that was not seized, they weren't able to seize it, and that was Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. But if you recall history correctly, the governor of South Carolina, the legislature, made it very clear that they were going to seize that fort, and Lincoln was looking for an opportunity to attack the South. He was not going to let the South go free without a fight. And see, this is the problem with Lincoln. Not that he was a anti-slavery radical, which he was not. Not that he was an abolitionist. He was no sort of abolitionist, really. But he was willing to use warfare to keep the country together. Okay? he was trying to find out, he couldn't just tell the American people, let's go fight the South, because half or maybe most of the American people in the North said, let them go. We don't even like these people. You know, especially in states like Indiana and Illinois and Kentucky, Missouri. They say, let them go. They don't want to be in our country. We don't want them. So you had to figure out a way. How can I figure out a way to get the South to fire the first shot and I can make it look like they started it? So he was a very clever, I mean, you say, well, that's kind of an evil way of thinking. Yes, that's true. But some evil people are clever. Hitler was clever, you know, Stalin, he was clever. Castro's clever. So how can I maneuver the South into attacking first? So he figured it out. Well, he said, we're not going to get out the fort. So first of all, he refused to leave the fort. That's an act of war right there. That's a de facto declaration of war. You refuse to remove your military from a foreign country. Now, of course, the best policy of the South would, in South Carolina, would just be ignore the fort. Just ignore it. Who cares? Let it stay there. What's it going to do? You know, it's nothing. Forget it. But they're very proud. You know, in the South, they're very prideful. You know, they got this chivalric sense of chivalry because, you know, most of you Southerners came from that part of England that supported King Charles I, the Cavaliers during the war in England. The long hair, you know, the long hairs, Cavaliers, the cavalry, chivalry. So they're not going to just sit there and take it. They're not going to do it. So when Lincoln says we're not going to get out of this forts, now their blood gets up. That's a very dangerous thing. Southern people's getting their blood up. Lincoln's happy, so you say, could ruffle their feathers. Then he says, well, we're going to reprovision the fort. We're going to send in supplies. Now that was very provocative, and so South Carolina said that's not going to happen. So when they tried to reprovision the fort, sending U.S. ships, and they fired on the ships, and the ships turned around. I mean, they were going to sink the ships, rightfully so. Well, now here's where Lincoln was really able to bait them properly. I mean, properly according to an evil design, you know what I'm saying, tactically. Now, if they hadn't been so hot-headed, the Southerners should have just said, look, they can't bring the ships in, okay? We've got that the harbor blockaded, so they should have had military installation blockading the harbor. When they got so angry, you see, they got so angry, they said, okay, you have a deadline, April. If you don't get out of this fort, such and such date here in April, we're going to attack the fort. And Lincoln told the commander, don't leave that fort no matter what. And then Major Anderson in the fort told the governor of South Carolina and the commander of the Southern Commander, PGT Beauregard, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard from Louisiana, by the way. He said, if you let me stay here another day or two, we're running out of food and supplies. We're going to have to surrender. You don't even need to fire on the fort. But they said, no, a deadline's a deadline. You have to leave. So, of course, they should not have done it. I didn't say they should not have done it morally. I wouldn't want anybody to interpret what I'm saying incorrectly. Yes, having the U.S. make an act of war against them, they had a right to shoot on the fort, okay? They had a right to fire on the fort, okay? I'm not disputing that. I'm saying it was unwise. Okay, the secession was unwise and firing on Fort Sumter was unwise, okay? They did it. They did it, okay? They did it. They did it. Then Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to march into the South and put down the rebellion, as he called it. Well, that was it. Then immediately, well, Kentucky did not break away, although they came very close. Missouri attempted to break away, but the U.S. invaded Missouri. You know, this General Nathaniel Lyons sent troops into St. Louis and prevented them from, he actually occupied Missouri with U.S. troops and prevented legislators from meeting. because it looked like they might be able to pull off a secession vote. All it would have been close. It would have been close. The sentiment in Missouri was not widespread to break away. In Maryland, it was widespread, in Baltimore especially, and they were going to meet. And there's almost a certainty that Maryland was going to break away. But the U.S. just basically invaded the state and abducted the legislators so they could not meet in the Capitol and vote to secede. So basically, Maryland was invaded before they could vote to secede and get invaded. Of course, they had many volunteers from Maryland come in and fight for their country and fight against the Yankee invasion. And yeah, I understand that. A lot of Maryland, a lot of Missouri people and a lot of Kentucky people fought for the South. So they attacked the fort, and Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. Oh, and talking about the flags, you know, the flag I showed you was too similar to the U.S. flag. So during battle, they would sometimes with all the smoke, with that gunpowder, it would look like the U.S. flag, and yet instances where troops were firing on their own side. So they adopted this new national flag, which was the battle flag on the white field. It was much more distinctive flag. But then the problem with that flag is in a battle, it could get wrapped around and then you might only see the white part and it looked like a surrender flag. So in 1865, they adopted the modified flag with a red bar, a vertical red bar, so that you would always have this red and it wouldn't look like a surrender flag. So that would be the 1865 to present national flag, Confederate flag. But once they fired on the fort and Lincoln called out the volunteers, then of course immediately Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and Arkansas seceded. And they were not looking to secede, but Virginia, who was probably least interested in seceding, they had a very great sense of honor in Virginia. And so they said that, oh, well, Lincoln has declared war on the states. And it would be in Virginia, they had such a great sense of honor. So they said it would be an impossibility. You see that, like they're saying, we're not in favor of secession. We think the South made a terrible mistake, but it's an impossibility that Northern troops are going to march through Virginia to attack fellow Southern states. That is an impossibility. That cannot occur. I mean, it just will not happen. And they knew Lincoln was intending to send U.S. invasion troops through Virginia to attack other Southern states. So Virginia had such a sense of honor. They said that could never occur. And they told Lincoln that you started this war. You started the war. We were going to stay in the Union, but you bastard, you started it. In Virginia, they, in some respects, were the most fanatical Southern patriots, Confederates. The Virginians, the great Virginians who fought against this Yankee invasion, and look how much Virginia suffered with Richmond being burned and Petersburg being burned. But they fought so hard, they were so, and you had great commanders like Thomas Stonewall Jackson, and he probably had a better strategy. His idea was that we don't even form armies. I mean, he was a little more forward thinking, and you have these conventional military formations, but you're fighting against extremely high-powered, rapid firing rifle muskets. I mean, the days of set formations like Napoleonic wars they're so obsolete in 1861 because of the rapid fire, high-powered, high-velocity weapons. And these troops on both sides are getting just slaughtered, right? And you say how ignorant they were. Yeah, they were ignorant up until World War I, because all the way up until 1918, they were still doing this. And against machine gun emplacements, these human wave attacks against rapid fire weaponry, and these great slaughters of World War I. It wasn't until 1918 when the Germans kind of rolled out their stormtrooper approach, which was to sort of alleviate this, that started to break up and the trench warfare started to, but so it took a long time, like 50 years for them to realize that, and this is not a video about tactics, but to realize that, okay, we can't fight a modern war with Napoleonic methods. And but Thomas Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, his idea was we don't form armies. We don't even fight the war conventionally. He just wanted to put up a black flag everywhere in the South, a skull and crossbones flag, and just say, blanket, a blanket, a policy. Any Northerner coming into the South will be immediately shot. There won't be any prisoners taken. Be no such thing as prisoners or prison camps. It'll just be a total fanatical resistance and if you come here, you'll be killed. That's what he wanted to do. But the other Southern leaders said, no, we gentlemen, you know, we're going to fight a conventional war with beautiful uniforms and beautiful horses and pageantry. But Jackson said, no, no, we need to fight it like true fanatics in a more of a guerrilla warfare. But they said, no, 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 pageantry. But he went along with it. Okay, fine, fine, we'll fight it like Napoleonic Wars. And he was the great fanatical. I mean, he wasn't scared of anything. He was unfortunately killed by a friendly fire accident. But it would have been interesting to see how it would have developed if they'd have followed his no quarter approach. We know what the result of the war was. The United States was much more powerful than the Confederate States, and they were much more ruthless. Even so, even with that ruthless total war, even with the ruthless approach and the extreme advantage in money and firepower, they weren't able to make the South give up. That's why in 1864, Lincoln and Sherman and them, Grant, adopted their total war policy, which was, we can't beat the armies in the field really, so we're going to launch a war on civilians. We're going to attack the civilian population of the South. And that's when they started doing the march through Georgia, you know, the march to the sea and through South Carolina. And we're going to go through the Shenandoah Valley, just chopping down everything, you know, destroying all the crops, killing, you know, burning all the houses, raping all the women, stealing all the property, and we'll demoralize the South and make it give up. So that was the war policy that, you know, was adopted in World War II. Terrorize, wait, that sounds like terrorism, right? Uh-oh, don't say that. But terrorize the civilian population into surrendering. And Lincoln approved of this policy, terrorizing the civilian population. Now you might say, but isn't it a war crime to attack civilians? It is a war crime. It's actually capital treason to make war against the states. And sometimes when people commit capital treason, they're shot and killed. That does happen. But anyway, that does occur. So the whole point of the video was the South did make a terrible mistake. I didn't say they were wrong to. Not wrong. Not wrong. Not wrong. Not immorally wrong by any stretch of the imagination. Right. Correct. Noble, but unwise to secede. Anyway, it's been 150 years. That's the end of the story. Not much, no use talking about it too much or getting too wrapped up in it, living in a dream world. So we do live in the United States. We may as well make the best of it. Thank you for watching this video production.